Pilot called police on Black Boy, instantly regrets it when his dad turns out to be FAA administrator. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday afternoon at a small regional airport in Virginia. 12-year-old Elijah Brooks was enjoying one of his favorite pastimes, watching planes take off and land. Standing near the airport's public observation area with a pair of binoculars and a worn aviation notebook, he jotted down tail numbers and A-plane models with fascination. Elijah, a budding aviation enthusiast who dreamed of becoming a pilot, had spent countless weekends just like this, quietly learning from a distance. But that afternoon took a dark turn when a private pilot, a middle-aged white man prepping his Cessna 182 for departure, noticed Elijah. Suspicion flickered across his face. Without engaging the boy or asking a single question, the pilot called airport security and reported a suspicious young man loitering near the hangars. The implication, unspoken but clear, was that Elijah's mere presence, young, alone, and black, was reason enough for alarm. Within minutes, 2 airport security personnel and a local police officer approached Elijah. Their questions were sharp and accusatory. "What are you doing here? Do you have a reason to be on airport property?" Elijah, visibly shaken but polite, explained that he was simply plane spotting and that the area was open to the public. He even showed his aviation log and pointed to a sign nearby indicating it was a designated viewing area. Still, they insisted on calling his parents. When Elijah's father arrived 20 minutes later, he was calm, but there was an unmistakable steel in his voice. Dr. Marcus Brooks didn't arrive in uniform or with an entourage, but his presence shifted the air immediately. As he approached the officers, he quietly asked, "May I ask what my son did to warrant this level of attention?" One of the officers replied that a pilot had called in a report and that they were following up on a potential trespassing concern. The pilot himself had returned to the scene by this point, arms crossed offensively, still suspicious. "I didn't recognize the kid, and he was looking too closely at planes and taking notes. These days you never know." Dr. Brooks nodded slowly, then calmly introduced himself. "I'm Dr. Marcus Brooks," he said. "I'm also the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration." The silence that followed was deafening. The color visibly drained from the pilot's face. The officers exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances, and Elijah, who had clutched his notebook with white-knuckled fear just minutes before, finally allowed his shoulders to relax. Dr. Brooks continued, "My son is passionate about aviation, just like I was at his age. And it's deeply troubling that instead of being encouraged, he's been treated like a threat for simply observing aircraft in a public space. This is exactly the kind of systemic bias that discourages young people of color from entering aviation and aerospace. And it's unacceptable." The pilot stammered something about safety protocols, but Dr. Brooks held up a hand. "Safety is one thing. Profiling is another. If you had taken a moment to speak with my son instead of assuming the worst, none of this would have happened." The encounter quickly made its way online after a bystander posted a video of the incident. The footage showed the police questioning Elijah, the confrontation with his father, and the moment the pilot realized who he had called the police on. Within hours, the story went viral, garnering national attention and sparking a broader conversation about racism in aviation, unconscious bias, and the barriers young people of color face when entering STEM fields. Dr. Brooks later released a public statement through the FAA, reiterating the need for equity and inclusion at every level of the aviation industry. "If we want the skies to be truly open for all," he wrote, "we need to confront the biases that keep talented, curious young people grounded before they ever have the chance to take flight." As for Elijah, he returned to the airport a few weeks later, this time invited personally by the airport director and given a private tour of the control tower and hangars. A local flying club even offered him a scholarship for youth flight training. He smiled shyly when asked if the experience had discouraged him. "No," he said, "it made me want to fly even more." And somewhere, in an FAA office with a panoramic view of Washington airspace, Dr. Brooks proudly hung his son's aviation notebook beside his framed credentials, a reminder that every great pilot starts by looking up, even if the world sometimes tries to keep them down. The story of Elijah Brooks didn't end at the airport tarmac. In fact, that moment, when his passion collided with prejudice, became the spark that lit a far greater journey. What could have been a bitter memory instead transformed into a national movement, carried by the winds of awareness, accountability, and inspiration. Following the viral video, media outlets across the country covered the incident. Interviews poured in, some from major networks, others from aviation podcasts and new programs. Dr. Marcus Brooks, though a seasoned professional accustomed to navigating high-stakes FAA meetings and political briefings, found himself in a different kind of spotlight, this time as a father confronting the quiet, insidious presence of racial profiling in spaces that claimed to be open to all. But Elijah, he was still a kid, a quiet, thoughtful one. He wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. He wanted to fly. The local flying club had offered him a scholarship, and soon Elijah began attending weekend flight lessons at the same airport where the incident had occurred. Some of the instructors who had once walked past him without a second glance now greeted him with warm nods. One of them, a former Navy pilot named Mr. Carrington, took Elijah under his wing. "You've got the heart for this, kid," he said after their first flight in a Piper Cherokee. "Let's get your wings." Week after week, Elijah soared higher, literally and metaphorically. His logbook began to fill up, his confidence grew, and with each takeoff, the weight of that day diminished a little more. But he never forgot it. In fact, he began to channel it. He asked his dad one day, "How do I make sure this doesn't happen to other kids?" Dr. Brooks smiled and said, "By becoming the kind of leader who changes the rules of the sky." That's when Elijah had an idea. With his dad's help, he launched Project Skybound, a mentorship initiative to connect minority youth with pilots, flight schools, aerospace engineers, and aviation academies. The goal was simple: open doors, break barriers, and redefine who gets to fly. The project began with just a few volunteers: his flight instructor, a local school teacher, and one air traffic controller from Richmond. But soon, word spread. By the end of the year, Project Skybound had chapters in 6 states and partnerships with aviation museums, tech companies, and even a few airlines. Elijah, still barely a teenager, gave talks at high schools and middle schools, standing in front of auditoriums filled with curious kids who looked like him, kids who had never imagined themselves in a cockpit until they saw him standing there, proud and poised. One moment in particular changed everything again. Elijah was invited to speak at the National Aviation Summit in Washington, D.C., a gathering of top aerospace leaders, government officials, and educational foundations. Nervous but determined, he stood before a crowd of thousands. "I was just watching planes," he began, his voice steady. "I wasn't hurting anyone. I was learning. I was dreaming. But someone saw me as a threat, not a student. And if my dad wasn't who he is, maybe I'd be just another name in a file somewhere." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "But now, I fly, and I teach others to fly. Not just with wings, but with possibility. And no one can take that away from me." The applause lasted a long time. Back home, the pilot who had called the police that day reached out. Through an official FAA inquiry, he had been required to attend bias and diversity training. But the experience had shifted something deeper. He asked to meet Elijah and Dr. Brooks. At first, they hesitated, but Elijah insisted. They met at the same observation deck. The pilot, Mr. Lowell, approached with humility and a clear sense of discomfort. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I made a judgment without asking questions, and I want to apologize. More importantly, I want to help, however I can." Dr. Brooks studied him. Elijah, after a moment, extended his hand. "Teach someone else," he said. "That's how you help." And so Mr. Lowell joined Project Skybound, volunteering his plane for flight experiences and speaking about his mistake at aviation safety seminars, his story now part of the movement instead of against it. Years passed. Elijah earned his private pilot license at 17. At 18, he entered an elite aviation engineering program. By 21, he was interning at NASA. And by 24, he returned to that same Virginia airport, not as a student, not as a victim, but as a keynote speaker for the grand opening of the Elijah Brooks Youth Aviation Center. A mural on the wall showed a young black boy with binoculars in hand, gazing up at a sky filled with aircraft, wings wide like opportunity. Above it, in bold lettering, were words that Elijah had once scribbled in his old notebook. "The sky doesn't care what color you are. Neither should we." And underneath, Elijah Brooks was now a name known across aviation communities, not because he chased fame, but because he stood for something bigger than himself. The Elijah Brooks Youth Aviation Center had become a hub of activity and opportunity. Inside its glass-paneled walls, classrooms buzzed with students programming drones, building model gliders, and practicing radio communication in simulators that once felt like distant dreams to them. But Elijah's path hadn't been free of turbulence. After earning his degree in aerospace engineering, Elijah faced the next daunting climb, gaining acceptance into NASA's highly competitive flight systems program. His mentors encouraged him. His credentials were solid. But at every interview, he sensed a hesitation, not because of what was on paper, but because of who he was. "You're impressive," one recruiter said, "but we're not sure if you're quite the right fit for this cohort." He'd heard that before. It was always fit, timing, or too ambitious. But Elijah, now seasoned in navigating coded language and polite rejection, took each setback as fuel. He returned to the center, doubled down on skybound programs, and began advocating for federal funding to make aviation training accessible in underserved communities. Meanwhile, he continued flying, clocking hours, training others, and earning new certifications until his experience was undeniable. It was during a community outreach event in Atlanta that a moment arrived that would redefine his trajectory yet again. A woman approached him after his speech, graceful, composed, with an unmistakable air of authority. "Elijah Brooks?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "I'm Commander Liana Ray. NASA." Elijah blinked. "From the Artemis lunar flight program." She smiled. "That's the one. We've been watching your work for years now. You're not just building your own career. You're building a path for others. That's exactly the kind of pilot we want leading missions." Within months, Elijah was invited to join NASA's pilot evaluation program, eventually being selected as a mission specialist trainee for Artemis 4, the next step toward establishing a lunar research base. But the training was brutal. Simulations pushed him to the brink of physical exhaustion and mental limits. He faced subtle skepticism from a few fellow cadets, most of whom came from legacy families with generations in military aviation or spaceflight. One night, in the sterile quiet of a Houston dormitory, Elijah stared out his window at the stars above. He thought of his younger self, standing alone by the fence of the regional airport, watching planes roar overhead. He could still remember the fear in his chest the day the police were cold on him. And he thought of his dad. Dr. Marcus Brooks had retired from the FAA the year before, having spent his final years spearheading sweeping reforms, revising profiling protocols, increasing scholarships for minority flight students, and embedding anti-bias education into FAA certification programs. But age was beginning to show in his gait and voice. Still, his pride in Elijah had never dimmed. In fact, Elijah's final interview for Artemis were conducted by none other than NASA Director Yvonne Weller, an old colleague of Marcus who'd followed Elijah's journey from the start. "Elijah," she said, "you've always carried two burdens, one of expectation and one of history. You've never let either slow you down. Are you ready to carry the weight of the future, too?" He looked her in the eye and said, "I've been ready since I picked up my first notebook." 3 years later, the world watched as Artemis 4 prepared to launch from Kennedy Space Center. Among the mission crew, Captain Elijah Brooks, pilot, engineer, educator, dreamer. As the countdown echoed across control rooms and living rooms around the globe, Dr. Marcus Brooks sat quietly in a front row seat beside Elijah's mother, his fingers laced and eyes glistening. In his pocket was Elijah's original aviation notebook, now tattered and faded, but sacred. 3, 2, 1. Engines roared. Fire lit the sky. As the rocket rose, a group of children at the Elijah Brooks Youth Aviation Center gathered around a massive screen. Some cheered. Others simply stared upward, their eyes wide with wonder. One little girl, maybe 10 years old, whispered, "He looks like me." Another said, "I want to do that someday." In orbit, inside the spacecraft, Elijah gazed down at Earth, a swirl of blue, white, and green. Silence wrapped around him like a dream. He opened his notebook, now digitized, and typed a single line for the mission journal. No one should ever have to fight this hard just to fly. But if I'm the last to fight, and the first to make it easier for others, then it was worth every mile. 1 year after Artemis 4, the Artemis 4 mission had been a complete success. Not only did it expand humanity's lunar presence with new habitats and deep-core samplers, but it also made history as the first lunar flight piloted by a black astronaut, Elijah Brooks. Upon returning to Earth, he was celebrated as a hero. Streets were renamed, documentaries were filmed, and invitations flooded his inbox from governments, universities, and global agencies. But Elijah didn't bask in fame. He knew that for every stage he stood on, there were still thousands of kids standing behind invisible fences, still being questioned, still being overlooked. So while the world wanted to make him a symbol, Elijah chose to be a builder. He turned down high-paid corporate offers and instead requested a special advisor position with NASA and the Department of Education. His goal? To integrate aviation and aerospace science into public school curricula across the United States, starting with the schools that had never once had access to a flight simulator or STEM lab. And then came the second dream. Project Vanguard. It began as a single conversation between Elijah and his old mentor, Commander Leon Ray. What if we trained a new generation of pilots, not just for the skies, but for the stars, she asked. Elijah leaned in. Not astronauts, not candidates, but mission-bound students. And so Project Vanguard was born, a partnership between NASA, historically black colleges and universities, indigenous technical schools, inner-city public schools, and private donors who believed in something more than lip service. The project's mission: identify, train, and launch the first fully student-led orbital mission by the year 2032. Skeptics laughed. Too ambitious. Too risky. Too soon. But Elijah had heard all that before. He poured everything into Vanguard. His connections, his credibility, his story. Students who had never sat in an aircraft were suddenly studying orbital mechanics. Young girls from rural towns were learning flight dynamics. Teenagers who'd once faced expulsion for being too distracted were now building microsatellites in converted school gyms. The program started small, just 20 students. But within 2 years, it grew into a national competition called Mission Possible. Students formed teams, built prototypes, coded navigation software, and pitched their designs before panels of engineers and astronauts. Finalists were sent to NASA's training campus for 2-month immersions. From there, a 10-person Vanguard crew was selected. They ranged in age from 17 to 21. None of them had pilot lineage. Few had money. But all of them had one thing in common. They had once thought, space isn't for people like me, until Elijah showed them it was. The resistance. Of course, not everyone supported Elijah's vision. Some in the aviation and defense community argued that space was no place for unseasoned civilians. Others warned of the dangers of lowering standards. A few conservative pundits accused Elijah of injecting social justice into national aerospace policy. At one point, Vanguard's funding was frozen by a powerful senator who called it an unnecessary experiment in optics. Elijah didn't respond publicly. Instead, he invited the senator to tour the Vanguard Training Center. There, they watched a 19-year-old indigenous girl pilot a drone swarm across a simulated asteroid belt. They listened as a teen coder from the Bronx explained his custom neural flight algorithm. And in the final room, they watched the Vanguard crew test a launch capsule mock-up, flawless in execution, breathtaking in precision. The senator walked out in silence. 2 weeks later, funding was not only restored, but increased. Vanguard I, the launch. On a calm morning in July 2032, 10 young pioneers stood suited and ready on the launch pad. Elijah, now in his early 30s, stood at mission control, heart pounding. A decade earlier, he had been that boy behind the fence, suspected, dismissed, nearly silenced. Now he was watching the future he helped build take flight. The countdown echoed through the world. 10, 9, 8. The rocket ignited. 7, 6, 5. In every Vanguard-affiliated school across the country, students held their breath. 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. A firestorm lifted the capsule into the clouds, and with it, the weight of centuries of exclusion. In orbit, the mission lasted 9 days. During that time, the young crew conducted microgravity experiments, deployed a student-designed weather satellite, and held a live Q&A with classrooms across the globe. One young pilot, Jasira Aiden, age 18, floated to the camera on day 6 and said, "We're not just up here because we're smart. We're here because someone believed we belonged." Elijah Brooks looked at the stars and then turned around and reached for the rest of us. Legacy. After the success of Vanguard I, international space agencies began modeling youth-focused programs on Elijah's model. Aerospace academies in Ghana, Brazil, and India requested consulting support. Scholarships poured into Project Skybound. But Elijah never forgot where it started. One afternoon, he returned to that quiet airport observation deck in Virginia. It was quiet now. Wind swept across the runway. A new sign had been installed nearby. "This is where dreams took off." Dedicated to Elijah Brooks, who proved the sky was just a beginning. And sitting alone at the edge of the fence was a boy, no older than Elijah had been that day. Binoculars in one hand, notebook in the other. Elijah walked over. "What are you watching?" The boy looked up. "Everything." Elijah smiled. "Good. Just remember, no one gets to decide how far you go but you." The boy blinked. "Are you?" Elijah nodded. "Yeah, I am." He sat down beside him, both watching the runway. Far above, a contrail curved across the sky like a promise waiting to be kept. 15 years later, the Earth had changed. New launch stations gleamed across continents. Hypersonic jets crisscrossed hemispheres in hours. Children in villages once isolated by oceans now designed spacecraft on tablets no thicker than a notebook. And at the center of this global shift, this quiet revolution in access, aspiration, and aerospace, was a man named Elijah Brooks. Now in his mid-40s, Elijah wasn't just a pilot, astronaut, or engineer. He had become a legend, not because he flew the highest, but because he had reached the farthest down, lifting others with him. The Brooks Institute for Aerospace and Equity, a sprawling international campus headquartered in Virginia, stood as both a flight academy and a global think tank. There, children from over 100 countries trained in aviation, orbital mechanics, sustainable propulsion, and leadership. In the center courtyard stood a sculpture, a young black boy holding binoculars, reaching upward, not toward the stars, but toward a hand reaching back down to him. Etched into the stone base were words taken from Elijah's first flight journal. "If the sky belonged to everyone, we'd all be flying. So I'll build a world where no one need permission to dream." One last mission. Despite his status, Elijah had quietly prepared for one final mission, not into space, but into history. He had been selected to command the Unity Initiative, a first-of-its-kind joint international voyage to establish the Lunar Gateway Village, a semi-permanent moon base dedicated not to defense, but to science, peace, and shared knowledge. The crew would include astronauts from countries long shut out of the space race: Kenya, Bangladesh, Chile, and Kazakhstan. 3 of them were Elijah's former students. As launch day neared, the world paused once more. Elijah gave one final public address at the Global Aerospace Summit in Geneva. No script, just a memory. "I was 11 years old when a pilot called the police on me for watching planes at an airport. Not because I was a threat, not because I had done anything wrong, but because he couldn't imagine that a kid who looked like me belonged in a place like that. He saw a problem. What he didn't see was a pilot, an engineer, a teacher, a builder. But you did. You, the teachers who didn't give up, the mentors who said, you belong, the kids who refused to believe that space had a gate. You made it possible. This moon base we're building, it's not a flag, it's a door. And my only job now is to leave it open behind me." Liftoff. On a crystal clear morning, the Unity spacecraft rose into the sky, slow, powerful, unwavering. As it ascended, news channels replayed clips of Elijah's life: the airport confrontation, his first solo flight, his moon landing, his speech before Congress, his creation of Project Vanguard, his students launching their own satellites. The world didn't just see a man. They saw a movement. They saw what happens when a boy behind a fence is given wings. Final transmission. 12 days into the mission, the Unity crew broadcasted their final message before lunar descent. Elijah's voice came through clearly. We see the moon rising below us. And beyond that, Earth. Every orbit reminds me. Perspective changes everything. What once looked like a line, a boundary, was only the edge of a door. We are not just landing on the moon. We are planting seeds for a future where space is a birthright, not a barrier. For the dreamers behind fences, for the sky watchers in silence, for those still waiting to be seen. We're here, and we're holding the door open. Legacy. Elijah Brooks never returned to Earth. During a routine systems update in Lunar Year 1, a sudden meteor storm struck a critical station. Elijah acted immediately, manually venting a corridor to save his crew. He succeeded. The others survived. But Elijah was lost. His body was never recovered. But his final act of selflessness ensured the lunar village was completed, and the Unity crew continued to thrive. His name became sacred, not just on monuments and in textbooks, but in the whispered hopes of millions of children who had once felt invisible. 50 years later, a young girl, curious, brown-skinned, with tangled curls and too many questions, stood at the edge of a Martian greenhouse, staring at the stars. She tapped her wearable device. "Play Elijah Brooks," she said. A hologram appeared. Elijah at age 12, sitting in the grass with his notebook, drawing jet trails in the sky. She smiled, then turned to her classmates and said, "One day, I'm going to build a ship named after him." And maybe she will, because in the end, Elijah Brooks didn't just change aviation. He didn't just change aerospace. He changed who believed they belonged. And that was the real final frontier. The end.